Have you ever felt the ground completely disappear beneath your feet? That moment when everything you've built, everything you've worked for, suddenly hangs by a thread because someone decided they wanted to destroy you. Well, let me tell you what happened to me. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why one single piece of paper can be more powerful than an entire army of lawyers. My name doesn't matter right now. But what matters is that I was just an ordinary person running a small consulting business, living a decent life, paying my bills, taking care of my family. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I was just trying to make an honest living in this complicated world we live in. But then, one day I received a letter that would change absolutely everything. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with a law firm's name embossed in gold letters across the top. My hands trembled as I opened it, and as I read the first few lines, I felt my stomach drop. I was being sued for $3 million. $3 million. Let that sink in for a moment. I didn't have $3 million. I didn't have even a fraction of that amount. The lawsuit claimed I had violated a non-compete agreement, stolen trade secrets, and damaged their business reputation. The company suing me was a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they had hired not just one lawyer, but an entire legal team from one of the most prestigious firms in the country. These weren't just attorneys. These were legal assassins who had built their careers on crushing people like me. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that evening, the letter spread out before me, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. My wife came home from work, saw my face, and immediately knew something terrible had happened. When I showed her the lawsuit, I watched the color drain from her face. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, both of us trying to process what this meant for our future, for our children's future, for everything we had worked so hard to build. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every conversation I'd ever had with this company, trying to figure out what I could have possibly done to deserve this. The worst part wasn't even the money they were demanding, it was the accusations themselves. They were calling me a thief, a liar, someone who had deliberately set out to harm them. And the thing is, I knew in my heart that none of it was true. But how do you prove your innocence when you're facing a legal machine designed to grind you into dust? How do you fight back when they have unlimited resources and you're just one person trying to survive? I want you to understand something important here. This wasn't just about money or business. This was about my reputation, my integrity, my entire identity as a person. These allegations, if they stuck, would follow me for the rest of my life. No one would hire me. No one would trust me. And I would become a cautionary tale, a warning story that parents tell their children about what happens when you cross the wrong people. The emotional weight of it all was crushing. I found myself unable to focus on anything, unable to eat properly, unable to be present with my family. Every conversation felt hollow because in the back of my mind, this lawsuit was always there, like a dark shadow consuming everything. My children would ask me to play with them and I'd go through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating costs, reviewing timelines, trying to remember every detail of every interaction I'd ever had with this company. Have you ever felt that kind of fear? That paralyzing terror that comes from knowing that powerful people are actively working to destroy everything you've built? It's a special kind of nightmare because you're awake for it, living through it minute by minute, unable to wake up or escape. And the worst part is that everyone around you expects you to just keep functioning normally, keep going to work, keep smiling, keep pretending that everything is fine when your entire world is collapsing. I spent the first few days after receiving that lawsuit in a complete daze, going through my daily routines like a zombie, barely present in my own life. The lawsuit had been filed 3 weeks before it actually reached me, which meant I had less time than I thought to respond. The legal deadlines were aggressive, clearly designed to put me on the defensive right from the start. I called every lawyer I could find in the phone book, explained my situation, and waited for someone, anyone, to tell me they could help. But here's what nobody tells you about the legal system. When you're going up against a massive corporation with deep pockets, most attorneys don't want to touch your case. It's too risky, too time-consuming, and frankly, not profitable enough for them. I must have contacted 20 different law firms in those first few days, and the responses were all variations of the same theme. Either they couldn't take the case due to conflicts of interest, or they quoted me retainer fees that were astronomical, sometimes $50,000 or $60,000 just to get started. Where was I supposed to get that kind of money? I was already living paycheck to paycheck, and now I was being asked to come up with more money than I made in an entire year, just to defend myself against accusations I knew were false. The frustration was overwhelming. I felt trapped in a system that seemed designed to favor whoever had the most money, regardless of who was actually telling the truth. One attorney I spoke with was brutally honest with me. He said, and I'll never forget these words, that in cases like mine, the corporation usually wins not because they're right, but because they can afford to keep fighting until the other side runs out of money and gives up. He told me that even if I was completely innocent, even if I had done nothing wrong, the cost of proving that innocence might bankrupt me anyway. He advised me to consider settling, to negotiate some kind of agreement where I'd admit to some minor wrongdoing in exchange for a reduced payment plan. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't admit to something I didn't do. I couldn't let my children grow up thinking their father was a thief and a liar. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had surrendered to injustice simply because I couldn't afford to fight it. So I made a decision that probably wasn't very smart from a purely practical standpoint, but it was the only decision I could live with. I decided to represent myself. Yes, you heard that right. I decided to go up against a team of high-powered corporate attorneys with decades of experience, and I was going to do it alone. Everyone thought I was crazy. My wife was supportive but terrified. My friends told me I was committing professional suicide. Even the one lawyer who had been somewhat sympathetic told me that representing myself was basically guaranteeing that I would lose. But what choice did I have? I couldn't afford proper legal representation, and I wasn't going to admit to crimes I didn't commit. So I did what any desperate person would do. I went to the public library, checked out every book I could find on civil litigation, and started teaching myself how the legal system actually works. I spent hours upon hours reading case law, studying procedural rules, learning legal terminology that might as well have been a foreign language. My dining room table became my law office, covered with stacks of papers, highlighted passages, sticky notes with reminders and deadlines. I barely slept during those weeks, surviving on coffee and determination, driven by the knowledge that if I failed, I would lose everything. My wife would bring me food and I'd eat it without tasting it, my eyes still scanning legal documents, my brain trying to absorb information at a pace that felt impossible. There were moments when I wanted to give up, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry. I remember one night around 2 a.m, I was reading through the opposing counsel's complaint for probably the 100th time, and I just broke down. I sat there at my kitchen table and cried, really cried, for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I cried for the injustice of it all, for the unfairness of a system that seemed designed to crush ordinary people, for the fear that I might actually lose and destroy my family's future in the process. But after I cried, something shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but alongside it grew something else. Anger. Not the destructive kind of anger that makes you do stupid things, but the focused kind that gives you strength and clarity. I was angry that these people thought they could bully me into submission. I was angry that they assumed I would just roll over and accept their lies. And that anger became fuel, transforming my fear into determination, my desperation into strategy. I started working on my response to the lawsuit. And this is where things get interesting because I realized something crucial about my situation. The company suing me had made their complaint incredibly detailed, listing dozens of specific allegations, dates, meetings, communications, all designed to make their case look airtight and overwhelming. But here's what they didn't realize. Every specific claim they made was something I could potentially disprove, and every detail they included was something they would have to prove in court. Their overconfidence had actually given me a roadmap. I spent days going through my own records, emails, calendars, receipts, anything and everything that might be relevant to the case. I had always been meticulous about documentation in my business, not because I expected to be sued, but because I believed in doing things properly and keeping good records. Now, that habit was about to save my life. I created a massive spreadsheet where I listed every single allegation they had made, and next to each one I noted what evidence I had that contradicted their claims. It was painstaking work, the kind of tedious, detailed analysis that makes your eyes blur and your head ache. But I kept at it because I knew this was my only chance. As I worked through their allegations one by one, a pattern started to emerge. Many of their claims relied on assumptions about what I must have done or must have known, rather than actual evidence. They were building a narrative telling a story about my actions and intentions, but when I looked at the actual facts, their story didn't hold up. For example, they claimed I had stolen client lists and used them to compete against them. But I had never worked directly with clients in my role at their company. I had been in a completely different department focused on internal process improvement. I had emails and organizational charts that proved this. They claimed I had violated a non-compete agreement by starting my own consulting business within 6 months of leaving their company. But when I pulled out my actual employment contract and read through it carefully, I discovered that the non-compete clause only applied to direct competitors in the same industry sector, and my new business was in a completely different sector serving completely different types of clients. They had twisted the language of the agreement to make it sound like I had violated it, but a careful reading showed that I hadn't. The more I dug into their allegations, the more I realized that their entire case was built on a foundation of misrepresentations and half-truths. They were counting on me being too intimidated or too poor to fight back, counting on me to see their expensive lawyers and impressive legal documents and just give up. But I wasn't going to give up. I filed my response to their complaint, and let me tell you, it felt amazing to finally fight back. I laid out my defense point by point, attached exhibits documenting everything I claimed, and I made sure every single word was backed up by evidence. I wasn't some fancy lawyer with flowery language, but I was thorough, I was accurate, and I was honest. My response was probably longer than it needed to be because I wanted to make absolutely certain that I addressed every single thing they had accused me of. When I filed it with the court and served it on their attorneys, I felt a small surge of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. Maybe, just maybe, I could actually win this thing, but I also knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, and their legal team wasn't going to take kindly to the fact that I was actually fighting back. I was right about that. Within a week of filing my response, I received a motion from their attorneys. They were asking the court to grant them summary judgment, which basically meant they were arguing that my defense was so weak that the judge should just rule in their favor immediately without even going to trial. The arrogance of it was stunning. They had looked at my response, seen that I was representing myself, and decided that I wasn't worth taking seriously. The motion was filed with multiple supporting documents, declarations from their executives, expert opinions, the whole 9 yards. It was designed to be overwhelming, to make me feel like resistance was futile, and for a moment, it worked. Reading through their motion, seeing the sheer amount of resources they were throwing at this case, I felt that old fear creeping back. How could I possibly compete with this? But then I remembered something I had read in one of those law books from the library. A case is won on facts and law, not on the thickness of the filing. It didn't matter how many pages their motion contained or how many expensive experts they had hired if their arguments weren't actually supported by the evidence. So I got back to work, reading through every page of their motion, analyzing every argument, looking for weaknesses, and I found them. Their motion relied heavily on a particular interpretation of my employment contract, but they had quoted it selectively, leaving out key phrases that actually supported my position. They had included declarations from executives claiming I had said certain things in meetings, but the dates they referenced didn't match up with my calendar records. They had hired an expert witness who claimed my business directly competed with theirs, but the expert clearly didn't understand the actual nature of my work, or theirs. Their case looked impressive on the surface, but underneath, it was full of holes. I worked around the clock preparing my opposition to their summary judgment motion, and this is where I learned something valuable about the legal system. The judges, at least the good ones, can see through smoke and mirrors. They're not impressed by fancy language or expensive legal teams. What they want is clarity, honesty, and evidence that supports your claims. So that's what I gave them. My opposition brief was straightforward, organized, and meticulously documented. I pointed out every misquotation, every factual error, every logical inconsistency in their arguments. I attached exhibits proving that their timeline didn't match reality. I included my actual employment contract, with the relevant sections highlighted showing that their interpretation was wrong. And then I added something that I think made a real difference. I included a declaration, a sworn statement, where I explained in my own words exactly what had happened, what my role had been at their company, why I had left, and how I had started my new business. I didn't try to sound like a lawyer. I just told the truth, simply and directly, the way you'd explain something to a friend. I described how I had been unhappy in my role at their company, how I had felt undervalued and overlooked, how I had decided to pursue my own path. I explained that I had been careful to avoid any conflicts of interest, that I had consulted with colleagues before starting my business to make sure I wasn't violating any agreements. I provided names, dates, and details that could be verified. When I finished writing that declaration, I read it over and felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened, at least I had told my truth. At least there was now a record under oath of what had actually occurred. I filed my opposition brief and waited. The hearing on their summary judgment motion was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and those 3 weeks felt like the longest of my entire life. I tried to stay busy, tried to focus on my work and my family, but the anxiety was always there, lurking in the background. I played out the hearing in my mind 1,000 times, imagining what the judge might ask, how I would respond, what arguments their lawyers would make. I practiced my oral argument in front of the mirror, pacing back and forth in my living room late at night, trying to sound confident, even though I felt terrified. My wife was incredible during this time. She held everything together, took care of the kids, managed the household, all while I was consumed by this legal battle. She never once made me feel guilty about the time and energy I was pouring into the case, even though I know it was hard on her. She would tell me that she believed in me, that she knew I was doing the right thing, and those words meant more to me than she'll ever know. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed running through my arguments, second-guessing every choice I had made, wondering if I should have tried harder to find a lawyer or negotiate a settlement. But it was too late for that now. I had committed to this path, and I had to see it through. When morning finally came, I put on my best suit, the one I usually saved for weddings and funerals, and I looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back at me looked older than I remembered, more tired, but also more determined. I kissed my wife goodbye, told my kids I loved them, and drove to the courthouse. The building was intimidating, all marble and high ceilings, designed to make you feel small and insignificant. I found the courtroom where the hearing would be held and sat down in the gallery, waiting for my case to be called. The opposing counsel arrived about 10 minutes later, a team of 3 attorneys, all wearing expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than my car. They didn't even look at me. To them, I was just another pro se litigant, someone playing lawyer who would be easy to defeat. Their arrogance should have intimidated me, but instead, it made me angry. They thought this was going to be easy. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Have you ever felt completely out of place, like you're in a situation that you have no business being in? That's how I felt sitting in that courtroom, but I refused to let it show. I kept my back straight, my expression calm, and I reviewed my notes one last time. When our case was finally called, I stood up and walked to the counsel table. The lead attorney for the other side gave me a condescending smile, the kind of smile that says he's already won and he's just going through the motions. The judge entered, we all stood, and the hearing began. The opposing counsel went first, and I have to admit he was good. He had clearly done this 1,000 times before. He spoke confidently, referenced case law from memory, and made their argument sound completely reasonable and justified. He painted me as someone who had betrayed his employer's trust, stolen valuable information, and deliberately violated contractual obligations. He made it sound like granting summary judgment was the only logical conclusion, that my defense was frivolous and unsupported by evidence. When he finished, the judge turned to me and asked if I wanted to respond. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward, and I stood up, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I'll be honest with you, my voice shook a little at first. I wasn't used to public speaking, and I certainly wasn't used to arguing in front of a judge. But as I started laying out my defense, something changed. I stopped thinking about how nervous I was and started focusing on the facts, on the truth of what had actually happened. I walked the judge through the timeline, showed how their version of events didn't match the documentary evidence, pointed out the selective quotations and misrepresentations in their motion. I didn't try to sound like a lawyer because I'm not one, but I spoke clearly and directly, and I could see that the judge was actually listening. She started asking questions, good questions that showed she had read the briefs carefully and was thinking critically about the issues. At one point, she asked the opposing counsel to explain a particular discrepancy I had pointed out, and I watched him fumble for an answer. He recovered quickly, but for just a moment his confidence had cracked, and I knew that the judge had noticed it too. The hearing lasted almost 2 hours, much longer than anyone had expected, and by the end of it, I was exhausted, but hopeful. The judge said she would take the matter under submission and issue a written ruling within 30 days. As I left the courtroom, the lead attorney for the other side approached me. I expected him to be angry or dismissive, but instead, he looked at me with something that might have been respect and said that I had done a good job presenting my case. It was a small thing, probably just professional courtesy, but it felt like validation. I had gone toe-to-toe with one of the best lawyers in the state, and I hadn't embarrassed myself. I had actually made him work for it. Those next 30 days were excruciating. Every day I checked my mailbox hoping for the judge's decision, and every day there was nothing. I tried not to obsess over it, but it was impossible. This decision would determine the entire course of the case. If the judge granted their motion, it would essentially be over. I would have to figure out how to pay them $3 million, which would probably mean bankruptcy. But if the judge denied their motion, it would mean we were going to trial, and I would have a chance to prove my innocence. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon, the envelope arrived. I recognized the court's return address immediately, and my hands shook as I opened it. I forced myself to read slowly, carefully, even though I wanted to skip to the conclusion. The judge had denied their motion for summary judgment. She found that there were genuine disputes of material fact that needed to be resolved at trial. She noted that my evidence raised serious questions about the accuracy of the plaintiff's version of events. She even cited specific examples from my brief where I had demonstrated factual inconsistencies in their case. Reading that decision, I felt a wave of relief so powerful that my knees almost gave out. I hadn't won yet, not by a long shot, but I had survived the first major battle. The case was going to trial, which meant I would have my day in court, a chance to tell my story in full and force them to prove their allegations. I called my wife immediately and told her the news, and I heard her start to cry on the other end of the line. They were tears of relief, of hope, of gratitude that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. That night we celebrated with a modest dinner at home. Nothing fancy because we still couldn't afford anything fancy, but it felt like the most important celebration of my life. My kids asked why we were so happy, and I told them that sometimes doing the right thing is hard and sometimes it feels like you're fighting against impossible odds. But you have to keep going anyway because the truth matters. I don't think they fully understood, but they were happy because we were happy, and that was enough. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. A trial meant months more of preparation, more sleepless nights, more stress and uncertainty. It meant I would have to stand in front of a jury and convince them that I was telling the truth, while the other side threw everything they had at me. It meant depositions, interrogatories, document production, all the complex machinery of litigation that I was still learning about as I went along. The next phase of the case was discovery, and this is where things got really interesting because discovery is where both sides get to demand documents and information from each other. I spent weeks preparing my discovery requests, carefully crafting questions designed to uncover the truth behind their allegations. I asked for all documents relating to their claims that I had stolen trade secrets, all communications about my employment and departure from the company, all evidence supporting their damages calculations. And here's where I made a strategic decision that would end up changing everything. I had noticed something in my research about their company. They were a large corporation with multiple divisions, and they had been involved in several other lawsuits over the years. So I crafted a very specific document request, one that asked for all communications between their legal department and the executives who had signed the declarations in their summary judgment motion. I wanted to see if there were any inconsistencies between what they were telling the court and what they were saying internally. I also requested all documents relating to any investigations they had conducted into my alleged misconduct. If they were accusing me of serious violations, surely they must have investigated first, right? And if they had investigated, there would be a paper trail. When I submitted my discovery requests, their attorneys objected to almost everything. They said my requests were overly broad, unduly burdensome, and not reasonably calculated to lead to admissible evidence. All the standard objections that lawyers make. We ended up having to go back to court for the judge to rule on the discovery disputes. And this time, the judge was clearly annoyed with their obstructionism. She ordered them to produce most of what I had requested, with only minor modifications. I could tell that the opposing counsel was frustrated. They hadn't expected me to know how to use discovery effectively, and now they were being forced to turn over documents they probably would have preferred to keep hidden. The documents started arriving in batches, hundreds and then thousands of pages of emails, memos, reports, and internal communications. It was overwhelming at first, trying to organize and review all of it. But I developed a system. I would spend several hours every evening going through the documents, flagging anything that seemed important or inconsistent with their claims. My dining room table, which had become my law office, was now covered with color-coded folders and stacks of documents organized by topic and date. And then, about 3 weeks into reviewing their document production, I found it. It was a single email, buried in a batch of several hundred other documents, and at first glance it didn't look particularly significant. But as I read it more carefully, I realized what I was looking at, and my heart started racing. The email was from the company's chief financial officer to their general counsel, sent about 2 months before they filed the lawsuit against me. In it, the CFO discussed their concerns about their declining revenue in a particular business segment. He mentioned that they were looking for ways to explain the decline to their board of directors and investors. And here's the key part. He suggested that they could potentially blame the losses on former employees who had left to start competing businesses, even if there wasn't clear evidence that these former employees were actually responsible for the losses. He specifically mentioned that they should consider legal action against former employees as a way to send a message and create a credible narrative for the revenue decline. My name wasn't mentioned in that email, but the timing and context made it clear that I was one of the former employees they were considering targeting. This was it. This was the smoking gun. This email showed that their lawsuit against me wasn't really about protecting trade secrets or enforcing non-compete agreements. It was about creating a scapegoat for their business problems. They needed someone to blame for their declining revenue, and I was a convenient target. I read that email probably 50 times that night, making sure I understood it correctly, making sure I wasn't misinterpreting or seeing something that wasn't really there. But no matter how many times I read it, the conclusion was the same. They had decided to sue me before they had even fully investigated whether I had actually done anything wrong. They had started with the desired conclusion and then worked backward to find or create evidence to support it. I immediately started looking through the other documents with fresh eyes, searching for anything else that might corroborate what that email suggested. And I found more. I found internal memos showing that their investigation into my alleged misconduct had been perfunctory at best. I found emails where executives admitted they didn't have strong evidence, but decided to proceed with the lawsuit anyway because they believed I wouldn't have the resources to fight back. I found communications showing that they had pressured witnesses to sign declarations without fully verifying the accuracy of the statements. It was all there, a pattern of misconduct and bad faith that completely undermined their case. The corporation I had once worked for, the one now trying to destroy me, had based their entire lawsuit on a cynical calculation that I would be too scared or too poor to defend myself. They had weaponized the legal system, using it not to seek justice but to shift blame for their own business failures. I spent the next few days carefully organizing all of this evidence, creating a detailed timeline that showed exactly how their case against me had been manufactured. I prepared a motion of my own, one that would expose their misconduct to the court and potentially result in sanctions against them. But before I filed it, I decided to do something that probably wasn't strictly necessary from a legal standpoint, but felt important to me personally. I sent a letter to their lead counsel, the one who had given me that condescending smile in the courtroom. In the letter, I explained that I had discovered evidence showing that their client's lawsuit was filed in bad faith. I attached copies of the key documents, including that email from the CFO. I gave them a choice. They could voluntarily dismiss the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile it later, and agree to pay my costs and fees, or I would file my motion with the court and expose everything publicly. I sent the letter on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon I received a phone call from their lead attorney. His tone was very different this time. No more condescension, no more arrogance. He asked if we could meet in person to discuss the case. We met at a coffee shop the next day, and it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. This lawyer, who had been trying to destroy me for months, sat across from me and essentially admitted that their case was falling apart. He tried to downplay the significance of the documents I had found, suggested that they had been taken out of context, but I could tell he knew he was in serious trouble. He made me an offer. If I agreed to keep the damaging documents confidential, they would dismiss the lawsuit and pay me a modest settlement to cover some of my costs. I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about everything I had been through, All the sleepless nights, all the fear and anxiety, all the time away from my family. Part of me wanted to take the offer, to just end this nightmare and move on with my life. But another part of me, the part that had kept me fighting all this time, knew that wasn't enough. I told him that I wanted more than just a dismissal. I wanted a public statement from the company acknowledging that their allegations against me were unfounded. I wanted a formal apology. I wanted them to pay not just my out-of-pocket costs, but a reasonable amount for the hundreds of hours I had spent defending myself. And I wanted assurance that they would never pursue any similar claims against me in the future. He said he would have to talk to his client and get back to me. 3 days later, I received a revised offer that met most of my demands. The company agreed to dismiss the lawsuit with prejudice, issue a statement clearing my name, pay me a settlement that, while not enormous, was substantial enough to compensate me for my time and expenses, and sign a comprehensive release of all claims. The statement they issued was carefully worded, as these things always are, but it clearly stated that after reviewing the evidence, they had concluded that I had not violated any agreements or engaged in any wrongdoing. It wasn't everything I wanted. There was no admission that they had filed the lawsuit in bad faith, no real acknowledgement of what they had put me through, but it was enough. When I signed the settlement agreement, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, definitely, that this nightmare was finally over. Satisfaction that I had won, that I had stood up to a powerful corporation and forced them to back down, but also sadness and anger about the whole experience, about the injustice of a system where they could file a baseless lawsuit against me and put me through hell, and the consequences for them were minimal. They paid some money, issued a statement, and moved on. For me, it had been months of my life, months of stress and fear and sacrifice, months that I would never get back. But I had won, despite everything, despite the odds, despite the fact that I had been representing myself against one of the most expensive legal teams in the country. I had won. The truth had mattered. The evidence had mattered. Justice, imperfect as it was, had been served. I need to take a moment here to ask you something because this is important. Have you ever been in a situation where someone more powerful than you tried to intimidate you into submission? Have you ever faced accusations that you knew were false but didn't know how to disprove? If you have, I want you to know that you're not alone, and I want you to share your story in the comments below. One of the hardest parts of going through this experience was feeling isolated, feeling like I was the only person who had ever faced this kind of situation. But I know that's not true. There are countless people out there fighting their own battles against corporate bullies, against people who use the legal system as a weapon. Your story matters. Your experience matters, and maybe, by sharing it, you can help someone else who is going through something similar feel less alone. Now, let me tell you about what happened after the settlement, because this story isn't just about winning a lawsuit. It's about what that experience taught me and how it changed my life. In the days immediately after signing the settlement, I felt emotionally numb. I had been running on adrenaline and determination for so long that when it suddenly ended, I didn't quite know how to process it. My wife and I went out to dinner to celebrate, a real celebration this time at a nice restaurant, and I remember sitting there across from her trying to feel happy but mostly just feeling exhausted. She reached across the table and took my hand and said something that stuck with me. She said that she had never been more proud of me, not because I had won, but because I had refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier and more rational. She said that my children had learned something important by watching me fight for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it seemed hopeless. And she was right. My kids had watched me spend months working on this case, had seen me stressed and tired but never defeated, had heard me talk about the importance of standing up for yourself and telling the truth. Those lessons, those values, were worth more than any settlement could ever be. In the weeks that followed, I started to reflect on everything that had happened and tried to extract meaning from the experience. The first and most obvious lesson was about the importance of documentation. If I hadn't kept detailed records, if I hadn't saved emails and calendar entries and contracts, I would never have been able to defend myself effectively. In our digital age, where so much of our professional lives happens online and through electronic communication, maintaining good records isn't just about being organized, it's about protecting yourself. You never know when you might need to prove what you said, what you did, or what you agreed to. The second lesson was about the legal system itself. I had always had a somewhat abstract understanding of how the courts worked, But going through this experience gave me a much deeper appreciation for both the strengths and weaknesses of our justice system. On one hand, I had seen how the system could be manipulated by those with resources, how legal procedures could be used to intimidate and exhaust opponents. On the other hand, I had also seen how the system, when it works properly, can protect individuals against powerful institutions. The judge in my case had been fair and impartial, had looked at the evidence rather than being swayed by expensive lawyers and impressive credentials. That gave me hope. The third lesson, and perhaps the most important one, was about my own capabilities. I had never imagined that I could represent myself in a complex civil lawsuit, had never thought I could go up against experienced attorneys and hold my own. But I had done it. I had taught myself enough about the law to be effective, had developed skills I didn't know I possessed, had discovered reserves of courage and determination that I hadn't known existed within me. That realization was empowering. It made me understand that we are often far more capable than we believe ourselves to be, that we can rise to challenges we think are beyond us if we're willing to work hard and refuse to give up. I also learned something important about fear. At the beginning of this ordeal, I had been terrified, paralyzed by the magnitude of what I was facing. But as the case progressed, as I started to understand the legal issues and build my defense, the fear never entirely went away, but it transformed into something else. It became motivation, fuel for my determination. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep moving forward despite the fear. It's acknowledging that you're scared but doing what needs to be done anyway. Have you ever discovered something about yourself that surprised you? Maybe you found strength you didn't know you had, or capabilities you never thought you possessed? That's what this experience did for me. It broke me down and built me back up, and the person who emerged from it was different from the person who had opened that lawsuit envelope all those months ago. I was harder in some ways, more cynical about corporate behavior and the use of legal power, but I was also stronger, more confident in my ability to face challenges, more certain of my values and my willingness to fight for them. One unexpected outcome of the whole experience was that word got around in my industry about what had happened. Other people who had worked for the same company or similar companies reached out to me, sharing their own stories of intimidation and legal threats. Some of them had settled cases they believed were unjust because they didn't think they could afford to fight. Others were currently facing situations similar to what I had gone through and wanted advice. I found myself becoming an informal advisor to people dealing with corporate legal bullying, sharing what I had learned about discovery, about responding to motions, about finding the weaknesses in an opponent's case. It felt good to turn my painful experience into something that could help others. I started documenting my experience more formally, writing down the strategies that had worked for me, the mistakes I had made and learned from, the resources that had been most helpful. I put together a kind of guide for people representing themselves in civil litigation, focusing particularly on cases where an individual is up against a well-funded corporation or institution. I didn't try to turn it into a business or make money from it. I just wanted to help people who were in the position I had been in, scared and overwhelmed and not sure where to turn. What I discovered through these conversations with others was that my experience, while unique in its specific details, was actually part of a much larger pattern. Corporations and powerful institutions regularly use the threat of litigation to silence critics, punish former employees, and avoid accountability for their actions. They rely on the fact that most individuals can't afford to defend themselves properly and will either settle unjust claims or simply be crushed by the legal system. The power imbalance is enormous, and our legal system, despite its principles of equal justice, often fails to adequately address this imbalance. But I also learned that it is possible to fight back, that individuals can sometimes prevail against much more powerful opponents if they're strategic, persistent, and willing to do the hard work of learning how to navigate the legal system. It's not easy. It's not fair that it should be necessary, but it is possible. I started to think more deeply about the broader implications of my experience. What does it say about our society that accessing justice often depends more on how much money you have than on the merits of your case? What does it say about corporate culture that companies are willing to destroy individuals to protect their bottom line or avoid embarrassment? These are uncomfortable questions, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think they're questions we need to be asking, conversations we need to be having. The law should be a shield that protects the weak, not a sword that the strong use to intimidate the vulnerable. In my case, I had been lucky in several ways. I had maintained good documentation. I had the support of my family. I had the time and ability to teach myself enough law to be effective. And critically, I had found that one document, that smoking gun email, that completely undermined their case. But what about people who aren't so lucky? What about people whose opponents are more careful about leaving paper trails? What about people who have to work multiple jobs and don't have time to spend hundreds of hours preparing a legal defense? The system fails them, and that's not acceptable. I want you to understand something important here, because this is one of the key lessons I took away from this experience. When you're facing a legal threat from a powerful opponent, they're counting on you to feel overwhelmed and powerless. They want you to look at their expensive lawyers and think you have no chance. They want you to see the complexity of the legal system and believe that you can't possibly navigate it without spending money you don't have. But here's what I learned. The legal system, for all its complexity, is ultimately based on evidence and logic. If you have the truth on your side and you can document it, you have a fighting chance. It won't be easy and it won't be fair, but it's possible. The key is to not let them intimidate you into giving up before you've even tried. Since this experience, I've also become much more aware of my rights and much more willing to stand up for them. I pay attention to what I'm signing when I start new business relationships or employment. I keep better records than ever before. I don't automatically defer to authority figures or assume that lawyers and corporations must know better than I do. I've learned to question, to verify, to look for the evidence behind claims rather than just accepting them at face value. These might seem like small things, but they represent a fundamental shift in how I navigate the world. Let me share something else that happened that I think is important. About 6 months after the settlement, I received a message through LinkedIn from someone who worked at the company that had sued me. This person had been relatively junior when I worked there, but had since moved up to a management position. They told me that after the settlement, there had been internal discussions at the company about their approach to litigation and their treatment of former employees. The CFO who had sent that damaging email had quietly been forced to resign, though officially it was framed as retirement. The company had implemented new policies requiring more thorough investigation before filing lawsuits against individuals. My case, this person told me, had actually led to some positive changes in how the company operated. I don't know if that's entirely true, or if this person was just trying to make me feel better about what I had gone through. And even if it is true, it doesn't excuse what they did to me. But I'd like to think that maybe, just maybe, some good came out of it. Maybe the next person who leaves that company and starts their own business won't face the same baseless accusations I faced. Maybe they'll think twice before weaponizing their legal department against someone who can't afford to fight back. That would be something. Now, I want to address something that some of you might be thinking. You might be wondering if I'm exaggerating or making myself sound better than I really was in this situation. I want to be honest with you. I made plenty of mistakes during this case. There were procedural things I didn't understand and had to figure out through trial and error. There were better arguments I could have made if I had known more about the law. There were moments when I got emotional or frustrated in ways that probably weren't helpful. I'm not a legal genius, and I'm not a hero. I was just a regular person trying to survive an unjust situation, and I got lucky in some key ways. But I also worked incredibly hard, harder than I've ever worked at anything in my life. I refused to give up when giving up would have been the easier path, and I maintained my integrity throughout, never lying or distorting the truth to make my case look better. That matters. That's something I can be proud of regardless of whether I made technical legal mistakes along the way. Looking back on the entire experience now, with the benefit of distance and perspective, I can see it as a defining moment in my life. Before the lawsuit, I had been comfortable, but not particularly confident. I had been successful in a moderate way, but had never really tested myself against serious adversity. The lawsuit forced me to discover who I really was, what I was really made of, and I learned that I was stronger than I had known. It also changed my relationship with my family. My wife and I had always been close, but going through this together, having her support me through the darkest moments, created a bond that's even deeper now. My children learned lessons about perseverance and integrity that I could never have taught them just through words. They saw their father face a real-world challenge and refuse to be defeated by it. That's a gift, in a strange way, even though I would never have chosen to go through the experience if I'd had a choice. I also developed a much deeper appreciation for people who fight systemic injustices as a regular part of their lives. There are activists, public interest lawyers, advocates, and ordinary citizens who stand up to powerful institutions every single day, often at great personal cost. Before my experience, I understood this abstractly, but now I understand it viscerally. I understand the toll it takes, the courage it requires, the sacrifices involved, and I have enormous respect for anyone who chooses that path. The settlement money, incidentally, didn't make me rich. After accounting for the costs I had incurred during the case and setting aside some for taxes, what remained was enough to pay off some debts and create a small financial cushion. It was meaningful, but it wasn't life-changing in a material sense. The real value was in the vindication, in the public statement clearing my name, in the knowledge that I had stood up to them and won. That was worth more than any amount of money. Since the case ended, I've continued to run my consulting business, and it's actually grown substantially. Part of that growth came from the publicity surrounding the settlement. When word got out that I had successfully defended myself against a major corporation, other businesses started to see me as someone who had integrity and courage, qualities they wanted in a consultant. It's ironic that their attempt to destroy my professional reputation actually enhanced it in the long run. I've also started doing some volunteer work with legal aid organizations, helping people who are representing themselves in civil cases. I can't provide legal advice since I'm not a lawyer, but I can share my experience, help people understand court procedures, assist with document organization, and provide moral support. It feels good to turn my experience into something that helps others. One thing I've noticed in working with other self-represented litigants is that the emotional and psychological aspects of facing a lawsuit are often harder than the legal challenges themselves. The stress, the fear, the feeling of being under attack, these can be overwhelming. I try to help people understand that these feelings are normal and valid, but they can't be allowed to paralyze you. You have to find a way to channel them into productive action. You have to take it one day at a time, one task at a time, one document at a time. Eventually, if you keep pushing forward, you get through it. I also want to address something for anyone watching this who might be facing a similar situation right now. If you're being sued or threatened with legal action by a former employer, a corporation, or anyone with more resources than you have, here's what I want you to know. First, don't panic. I know that's easier said than done, but panic clouds your judgment and prevents you from thinking strategically. Take a deep breath, give yourself a moment to process the situation, and then start taking concrete steps to address it. Second, gather and organize all relevant documents immediately. Contracts, emails, text messages, calendar entries, anything that might be relevant to the dispute. Create a detailed timeline of events. Write down everything you remember about key conversations and interactions while the memories are still fresh. This documentation is your ammunition. Third, understand your deadlines. Legal proceedings have strict time limits for responding to various motions and complaints. Missing a deadline can be catastrophic, so make absolutely sure you know when you need to file responses and build in extra time to account for unexpected complications. Fourth, use available resources. Public law libraries, court self-help centers, legal aid organizations, online legal research tools. There are more resources available than you might think, and many of them are free or low cost. You don't need to have all the answers immediately, you just need to know where to look for them. Fifth, don't be intimidated by legal jargon or complex procedures. The law is complicated, but it's not magic. It's a system of rules, and rules can be learned. You might have to put in significant time and effort to understand what you need to understand, but it's not impossible. Sixth, focus on the facts and the evidence. Emotional arguments and personal grievances might feel satisfying, but courts care about provable facts and applicable law. Build your case around evidence and make sure every claim you make can be supported with documentation. And finally, take care of yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. You need to maintain your physical and mental health, maintain your relationships, and maintain your ability to function in other areas of your life. Set boundaries around how much time you spend on the case each day. Make time for exercise and sleep. Lean on your support network when you need to. Before I finish this story, I want to circle back to that document I mentioned earlier, that email from the CFO that became the smoking gun in my case. Finding that document wasn't just luck, although luck certainly played a role. It was the result of me being strategic about my discovery requests, thinking carefully about what internal communications might exist, and being willing to spend hours and hours reviewing thousands of pages of documents. The lesson here is that when you're facing a powerful opponent, you have to look for their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. You have to think about what they might not want to disclose, what contradictions might exist between their public claims and their private communications. You have to be thorough and persistent in demanding documents and information, even when they try to obstruct you. In my case, that one email validated everything I had been saying. It proved that their lawsuit was about finding a scapegoat rather than seeking justice. It demonstrated bad faith in a way that was impossible for them to explain away. And once I had it, the balance of power shifted dramatically. They went from being completely confident in their case to being desperate to settle before that email became part of the public record. That's the power of evidence. That's why documentation and discovery matter so much. The truth really can set you free, but only if you can prove it. Now I want to talk to you directly, you who have made it this far in my story. I've shared this experience with you not just because it's dramatic or interesting, although I hope it has been, but because I believe it contains important lessons about justice, about standing up for yourself, about refusing to be intimidated by power. We live in a world where powerful institutions often act with impunity, where the wealthy can use the legal system as a weapon, where ordinary people are expected to simply accept injustice because fighting back seems impossible. But it's not impossible. It's hard. It's scary. It's unfair that it should be necessary. But it's not impossible. And every time someone like me stands up and fights back, it makes it a little bit easier for the next person. It sends a message that we won't just roll over and accept being crushed. It demonstrates that truth and evidence still matter, that the legal system, for all its flaws, can sometimes work the way it's supposed to. I want to understand something about you now, because your engagement with this content matters to me. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of institutional authority? Have you ever wanted to fight back but didn't know how? Have you ever been told that you didn't have a chance and proved them wrong? Or maybe you're facing a situation right now where you're not sure what to do, where you're weighing whether to fight or surrender. Whatever your situation, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. Let's create a community of people who refuse to accept injustice, who support each other in standing up for what's right. Your comment isn't just a comment. It's a statement that you're engaged with these issues, that they matter to you. And if this story has resonated with you, if it's touched something in your heart or made you think about these issues in a new way, do me a favor. Hit that like button. I know it seems like a small thing, but it actually matters. The YouTube algorithm promotes content that gets engagement, and the more people who like this video, the more people will see it. That means more people will hear this message about standing up to corporate bullying. More people will understand that they have options even in situations that seem hopeless. More people will be inspired to fight for their rights, rather than accepting injustice. And while you're at it, please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales. This channel is dedicated to sharing real stories about real people facing real challenges. Stories that aren't sanitized or sugar-coated. Stories that show both the struggles and the victories. By subscribing, you become part of a community that values truth and authenticity, that believes in the power of sharing our experiences to help and inspire others. Make sure you click that notification bell too, so you'll know whenever new content is posted. We have so many more stories to share, stories that will make you think, make you feel, maybe even inspire you to take action in your own life. Finally, I want to leave you with this thought. The story I've shared with you today isn't really about me, and it's not really about a lawsuit. It's about the fundamental question of whether ordinary people can stand up to powerful institutions and win. It's about whether justice is accessible only to those who can afford it, or whether it's a right that belongs to everyone. It's about whether we as individuals have the courage to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against us. My answer, based on my experience, is yes. Yes, we can stand up. Yes, we can fight back. Yes, we can win. It won't always be easy, and it won't always be fair, but it's possible. The system is flawed, but it's not completely broken. There are judges who care about justice, rules that protect the vulnerable, procedures that can level the playing field if you know how to use them. But it requires courage. It requires persistence. It requires a willingness to stand up for yourself even when everyone tells you that you don't have a chance. When I received that lawsuit, When I saw those $3 million in damages they were claiming, I could have given up right then. I could have accepted their characterization of me as a thief and a liar, could have negotiated some kind of settlement where I admitted to wrongdoing I hadn't committed. It would have been easier in many ways. It would have been less stressful, less time-consuming, less risky. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let them destroy my reputation. Couldn't let my children grow up believing their father was dishonest. Couldn't live with myself, knowing I had surrendered to injustice. So I fought back. And against all odds, I won. Not because I'm special or uniquely talented, but because I refused to give up. Because I did the work. Because I had the truth on my side, and I was able to prove it. That's the power each of us has. The power to stand up for ourselves, to demand accountability, to insist on being treated fairly. We don't always win. Life isn't a movie where good always triumphs over evil. But we have a chance, and sometimes that chance is enough. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to watch all the way to the end. And remember, your story matters too. Whatever you're facing, whatever challenges you're dealing with, you're not alone. There are people out there who understand, who have faced similar struggles, who want to support you. Reach out, share your story, ask for help when you need it, and never forget that you are stronger than you think you are. Now go ahead, leave that comment, hit that like button, subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales, and let's build a community of people who refuse to accept injustice, who stand up for what's right, who support each other in the fight for truth and fairness. Together, we're stronger than any corporation, any legal team, any institution that tries to crush us. Together, we can make a difference.